think the war is going in their favor as long as they keep gaining land militarily. But they do have to play along to a certain extent with Donald Trump because they don't want to alienate him to the extent that he decides to renew military aid support to Ukraine. They don't want him to look a fool and do something like that. And they also need to make sure that Donald Trump is able to blame the Ukrainians and walk away from this peace deal, walk away from supporting Ukraine altogether.
The EU says it's very close to agreement on using £100 billion worth of frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine after months of negotiations. That news breaking in the last half hour. Well, Ukraine itself hopes to present a reworked peace plan to the White House today, following meetings with European allies. But it comes as Donald Trump launches an attack on the very same countries that helped revise that plan. And in an interview this morning, the American president described Europe as a collection of decaying nations led badly.
I think they're weak, but I also think that they want to be so politically correct. I think they don't know what to do. Europe doesn't know what to do. They don't know what to do on trade either. I mean, I look at a lot of the trade situation that's going on over there. It's a little bit dangerous, but Europe, they want to be politically correct, and it makes them weak. That's what makes them weak.
That was Donald Trump speaking to Politico. In a moment, we'll speak about those frozen Russian assets with the political economist and former EU Commission advisor, Philippe Legrain. But first, let's go to the Times' Ukraine correspondent, Maxim Tucker. Maxim, hi there. What do we know about this revised peace plan?
So obviously the crucial point is that Ukraine is not prepared to give away any land. It's not prepared to give away this fortress belt in the Donbass, which Russia has been trying to take for the past 11 years and obviously more actively since the full-scale invasion. I think obviously we can expect that Ukraine doesn't want to see these 100 billion in frozen assets going into joint US and Russian ventures. So it wants to keep those going to Ukraine. And I think we don't know very much about what the rest of the document will involve, but Zelensky says that he has stripped out the anti-Ukrainian elements.
Well, I mean, given that Zelensky is heavily involved in this, as you'd expect him to be, what chance that Russia's actually going to be at all interested in this revised deal?
Well, I think the Russians aren't going to be interested in any peace deal as long as they think the war is going in their favor, as long as they keep gaining land militarily. But they do have to play along to a certain extent with Donald Trump because they don't want to alienate him to the extent that he decides to renew military aid support to Ukraine. They don't want him to look a fool and do something like that. And they also need to make sure that Donald Trump is able to blame the Ukrainians and walk away from this peace deal, walk away from supporting Ukraine altogether.
You're going to be talking a little bit more about your reporting from the territories with John Pienaar. He's mentioned that on Drive Time. But why is Zelensky refusing to hand any land over at all?
Well, this is the fortress belt. I mean, it's home to 350,000 Ukrainians. So you're talking about giving 350,000 Ukrainian homes to Russians to make sure they live under occupation, which is something I think no Ukrainian leader wants to do. But it's also the best fortified part of Ukraine. It's a series of 4 major cities along a major highway and several towns which have been fortified over the last 11 years. And it is the best place where Ukraine can hold the Russians back. If the Russians gain access or gain control of the full amount of the fortress belt, they have an amazing launch pad to attack north into the Kharkiv region or west into the Dnipro region, which are home to Ukraine's 2nd and 4th largest cities.
And as the war drags on and on, what is the actual state of the front line? Is there still very much the feeling, Maxim, that Russia has the upper hand at the moment on the front line?
Well, Russia does have the upper hand on the front line in that it's got momentum and it's moving forward, and Ukraine is constantly having to react and firefight in different places. But it is only taking very small swathes of territory, and it's losing an incredible amount of infantry as it does so. It's really astonishing the number of lives that are being lost for incremental gains. And of course, Putin seems happy to accept those losses as he creeps forward. But I mean, there's a lot still that Europe and the US could do to increase the cost of Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Maxim. That's Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent. Now, turning to Europe, let's bring in the political economist Philippe Legrain, who advised European Commissioner President José Manuel Barroso. Philippe, thanks so much for joining us. How significant is this closeness to agreement, do you think?
I think this is extremely important. Ukraine is about to run out of money sometime early next year. The US under Donald Trump is no longer willing to help support it. Therefore, it is down to Europe, which means the EU plus the UK plus perhaps Canada and Australia to step in. And obviously the EU is the biggest player there. And all the action is about how to make use of roughly 210 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets. That's about 185 billion pounds, most of which is in Belgium. And the EU has come up with plan after plan to try and make use of them. And there are two sets of objectives. The first is Hungary. Its Prime Minister Viktor Orban is pro-Putin and doesn't want to see any more money go to Ukraine. And the second is Belgium, because Belgium is where most of the frozen assets are located, and they're worried that if the whole scheme unravels, that they'll be on the hook for all this money, and they want guarantees from other EU countries that won't be the case.
Did you say, Philippe, that most of that money that could be unfrozen assets-wise is in Belgium?
That's correct, yeah. It's 185 billion.
What's it all doing in Belgium?
Okay, there is what's called a central securities depository, which is like basically a custodian for financial assets called Euroclear. It's the biggest international one in the world. There are roughly 42 trillion euros worth of assets there. And roughly 185 billion are frozen Russian assets, which were basically reserves of the Central Bank of Russia that were frozen after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
How much of a game changer would it be for Zelensky in Ukraine if those assets were unfrozen and, channeled towards Ukraine, whether that's efforts in the war or redevelopment sort of after the war? How big a deal would that be for Ukraine's efforts?
I think it would be extremely important at the moment. As I said, first of all, Ukraine can no longer rely on the US. Second of all, Ukraine is living hand to mouth. It's surviving on drips and drabs of aid. Here, if you say we're going to commit this big amount of money for multi-year financial and military support, that gives Ukraine the security to stand its ground. Also, it raises the cost to Vladimir Putin. Putin is counting on ultimately Europeans folding. Like Donald Trump, he thinks that Europeans are weak, so it would raise the cost to Putin. Also, it would stop Donald Trump getting his hands on the assets in the 28-point deal that he tried to float recently. That involved earmarking those assets frozen in Europe for joint investment schemes for his cronies and that of Vladimir Putin. And last but not least, it would ensure that if there are proper peace negotiations, that the EU has to be at the table, because obviously it has all these frozen assets which Russia wants to get back.
We played the clip earlier, Philippe, of Donald Trump saying some pretty, not very friendly things to European leaders, criticising them about trade, criticising the way they're going about trying to negotiate this peace deal. How can Europe respond to this attack, and how do you think it will, given we continue to see so many European leaders do their very best to cozy up to Donald Trump, regardless of what he says about them?
Well, yeah, I think Europe, and I mean both the EU and the UK, are in a mess because we are defensively weak and we're reliant on the United States for our security at a time when there is a war in Ukraine that threatens to spread further if Ukraine doesn't hold the line, and indeed is spreading further with Russian hybrid attacks, things like cyber attacks, sabotage, arson, assassination of political enemies, including in the UK, and so on. So the EU, Europe is in a very weak position, and the warning signs that America wanted to disengage from Europe have been there for a while, and Europeans have had their head in the sand. Also, public finances are strained. We know that in this country. It's also true in France and elsewhere. People don't want to spend more in defence. And the result is that, we're in a very difficult position, which is why we're trying to resort to using these frozen assets as a preference to borrowing the money through government means, which would be another way to do it.
I mean, do you think European leaders will take any comfort in the fact that Donald Trump is still engaging in this issue, even though he's having a go at them? I mean, there was a suggestion a few months ago that, he was just felt he hadn't been able to get the quick win, the quick peace deal he wanted. He triumphed his peace deal in the Middle East. It wasn't happening, getting a peace deal between Putin and Zelensky. At least he is still engaging in this conflict and trying to broker a peace deal.
Well, yeah, it depends what kind of peace deal. I think obviously he is mercurial. He's all over the place. One minute he is pro-Putin, at the minute he's a bit more pro-Zelensky. Sometimes he loves Europe, and other times he hates it or despises it. So yeah, I don't think you can rely on him either way. I think that the way forward for Europeans together is to wake up and say, we need to try and keep Trump as engaged as possible for as long as possible. At the same time, we need to be ready to chart our own course. And that means massively increasing defense spending, as Poland has done, and indeed as Germany is doing, and we in Britain and in France, that is not happening yet. It means, therefore, providing Ukraine with the help that it needs. And only then we'll be able to stand up to Trump on trade and other issues.
That is Philippe Legrain, who advised the European Commissioner, President Jose Manuel Barroso. Thank you.